What was the real reason behind the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? A question that has stirred many debates. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union, a superpower, launched an invasion on Afghanistan, a country that, on the surface, didn't seem to pose much of a threat. Yet the invasion was met with fierce resistance from the Afghan Mujahideen, with the United States covertly lending a helping hand. This seemingly local conflict became a pivotal battleground in the larger Cold War struggle. To understand the reason, let's delve into the historical context. The late 70s and early 80s, a period of intense geopolitical tension. This era was caught in the icy grip of the Cold War, a confrontation of epic proportions between the world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a chess game played on a global scale, a battle of ideologies, with capitalism pitted against communism. In this standoff, the world was effectively divided into two camps. Countries were caught in a web of alliances, treaties, and counter-treaties. The superpowers didn't directly engage each other in military conflict, but they were always on the brink, always ready to flex their nuclear muscles. This was the age of proxy wars, where local conflicts were backed by these superpowers to gain strategic advantages. The Soviet Union, under the banner of spreading communism, was busy extending its influence across the globe. From Eastern Europe to Africa, Asia to Latin America, the red wave was spreading. But it wasn't just about ideology, it was also about strategic positioning, about gaining a foothold in key regions around the world. Now, let's shift our focus to Afghanistan. This was a nation in turmoil. A series of coups in the 70s had left the country politically unstable. The government was weak and struggling to maintain control. In addition, there were deep societal divisions along ethnic and religious lines. It was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark, and the Soviets saw an opportunity in this chaos. Afghanistan, with its strategic location bordering Iran and close proximity to the oil-rich Persian Gulf, was an attractive target. The Soviets saw it as a way to counterbalance the influence of the United States in the Middle East. Furthermore, a friendly communist government in Kabul could serve as a buffer against Western-leaning Iran. In this climate, Afghanistan became a strategic interest for the Soviet Union. December 1979, the Soviet Union makes its move. The chill of winter was matched by the icy ambition of a superpower as the Soviets launched an invasion into Afghanistan. This was more than a territorial dispute. It was a strategic chess move in the grand game of global politics. The Soviets were drawn in by the allure of a friendly regime on their southern border and the prospect of thwarting any potential American influence in the region. Their advance was swift and calculated. Striking first at the capital, Kabul, they quickly seized control, placing their puppet, Babrak Karmal, at the helm of the Afghan government. Karmal, a committed Marxist, was a fitting choice for the Soviets. His ascendancy was a clear message to the world. Afghanistan was now under the Soviet sphere of influence. But the invasion didn't stop at Kabul. Major cities like Herat, Kandahar, and Mazar-e-Sharif fell one after another, like dominoes, to the relentless march of the Red Army. The Soviets were thorough, ensuring their grip tightened across the vast and varied landscape of Afghanistan. The rugged mountains, the barren deserts, and the bustling cities, they all bore the imprint of the Soviet hammer and sickle. Yet, despite their military might and strategic maneuvering, the Soviets overlooked one crucial factor: the indomitable spirit of the Afghan people. The Afghans were not a conquered people. They were a proud nation with a rich history of resistance. The Soviet invasion was a foreign intrusion, a violation of their homeland. It was a spark that would ignite a fire of resistance that would burn for nearly a decade. The Soviets had made their move, they had set the board, and they were confident of their victory. But they were about to learn a harsh lesson, a lesson that has been taught to countless invaders throughout history, from the Mongols to the British. But the people of Afghanistan were not to be easily dominated. The stage was set for one of the most grueling and significant conflicts of the 20th century. The invaders faced fierce resistance from the Afghan Mujahideen. A term often translated as strugglers, or those engaged in jihad, the Mujahideen were a diverse collection of Afghan fighters united by a common cause: to repel the Soviet invaders from their homeland. The formation and motivation of the Mujahideen were as varied as the rugged Afghan terrain itself. Some were motivated by a strong sense of nationalism, while others were driven by religious fervor, viewing the fight against the atheist Soviets as a sacred duty. Many were simple farmers and herdsmen who put down their plows and picked up rifles to defend their homes and families. During this time, the Mujahideen's guerrilla warfare tactics became a thorn in the side of the Soviet forces. They employed hit-and-run strategies, ambushing Soviet convoys, then disappearing back into the hills and mountains. They laid deadly traps, using the knowledge of their homeland to their advantage. Despite the Soviets' superior firepower and technology, they struggled to adapt to this unconventional style of warfare, and their heavy machinery was often rendered useless in the harsh, mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. The Mujahideen also used psychological warfare to their advantage. They capitalized on the fear and uncertainty of the Soviet troops, many of whom were young conscripts, far from home, and unprepared for the brutal realities of guerrilla warfare. But the challenges posed by the Mujahideen weren't just military. They also presented a political challenge for the Soviet Union. The ferocity and resilience of the Mujahideen resistance helped to galvanize international attention and support for their cause, making it increasingly difficult for the Soviets to justify their occupation. This was a fight of David against Goliath, of an asymmetrical struggle where the seemingly weaker party managed to hold its ground against a global superpower. The Mujahideen were fighting not just for their homeland, but for their way of life, their traditions, and their faith. But the Mujahideen were not alone in their fight. The next scene will delve into the covert support they received, transforming this local resistance into a global proxy war. Behind the scenes, a greater power was at play. This was not merely an invasion or a resistance, it was a chess game played out on a global scale. As the Soviet Union and the United States of America locked horns in the Cold War, the rugged terrain of Afghanistan became an unexpected battleground. While the Soviets were physically present in Afghanistan, the US operated from the shadows, covertly providing support to the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen. This wasn't just about helping a nation achieve its freedom, it was about undermining the Soviets, about tipping the balance of power in favor of the West. The United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency, funneled billions of dollars in aid, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen. Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft weapons, and other military equipment were supplied surreptitiously, enabling the Afghan fighters to wage a more effective guerrilla war against the technologically superior Soviet forces. But the implications of this proxy war extended far beyond the borders of Afghanistan. It was a manifestation of the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, between the East and the West, a struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the subsequent proxy war was a pivotal moment in the Cold War. It strained the Soviet economy and military, contributing to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, it bolstered the United States' position as a global superpower. Yet the proxy war was not without its unintended consequences. The Mujahideen, once the underdogs fighting for their homeland, morphed into different factions and groups, some of which would later become significant players in global terrorism. This was an unforeseen aftermath of a conflict ignited by superpowers in their quest for dominance. The battlefield in Afghanistan was a microcosm of the global Cold War struggle. It was a war within a war, a conflict that served as a mirror, reflecting the larger geopolitical tensions of the time. It was a stark reminder that in the grand game of power, nations are often merely pawns, moved and sacrificed for a greater cause. So what was the real reason behind the invasion, you might ask? It's a question with layers, each revealing a complex web of geopolitical interests and strategic maneuvers. At its core, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s was driven by a desire to extend its sphere of influence, a classic move in the Cold War playbook. The Soviet Union aimed to prop up a friendly government under threat from internal rebellion, ensuring a foothold in the strategically significant region of South Asia. Meanwhile, the US saw an opportunity to counteract Soviet influence. It covertly provided support to the Afghan Mujahideen, the resistance forces that launched a fierce and unyielding campaign against the Soviet occupation. This move turned Afghanistan into a proxy battlefield, a pivotal front in the larger Cold War struggle. The long-term effects of this conflict on Afghanistan were profound. The country was left in ruins, its infrastructure decimated, and its populace deeply scarred. The end of the Soviet occupation did not bring peace, but rather a power vacuum, leading to years of civil war and instability. In the grand scheme of the Cold War, Afghanistan was a battlefield where the world powers clashed indirectly, leaving a lasting impact on its people and history. This chapter of history serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of geopolitical power plays.